Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. So I can see some names who we know from PAAR-Net. Welcome. I would suggest to wait just another minute or two before to actually start the meeting, the webinar. Some other people might join us as we are still waiting for quite some people now. And I could suggest maybe in the meantime, as we did during the previous webinars, we would love to know where the people are connecting from. So if you want to use the chats to tell us where you are connecting from, please feel free to do so. And we also have this little tradition within PAAR-Net of also sharing about the weather forecasts in our countries. So feel free to tell us if you are living a heat wave or not. So we have a sunny Ireland, a tropical Germany. That's quite unusual. In Romania, also wonderful summer. So we'll give it one more minute, and then we'll begin. That's also fine if people join us a bit later. That's all absolutely fine. And we have Portugal also represented here, Porto, excellent weather. There is someone in South Africa with a pleasant winter. Manchester, 23 degrees. We can see that our audience is quite international. That's good. Tallinn, Estonia is also here represented. All right, I would suggest to start. People can continue to join us while we are starting, especially the introduction of this webinar. My name is Marion Scheider-Yilmaz. I'm a sociologist at Lorraine University in France, and I will be chairing the session today. So this is the third webinar. As you can see it on the screen, the third webinar in the PAAR-Net's webinar series named Meaningful Participation and Voice. When does older adults' participation become a democratic action? And this webinar is organized by the Working Group 2 of PAAR-Net's Community and Place. And this is part of the cost action, PAAR-Net, and funded by the European Union. So following our previous webinars, in which we explored participation and civic engagement from both conceptual but also practical perspectives, today we are going to turn our attention to the topic of unpaid care. So we are really delighted to welcome Dr. Maria Cheshire Allen, who will present Beyond the Breaking Point, addressing the civic depths of unpaid care in Wales. So drawing on findings from 2 research projects, the presentation will examine how unpaid carers are recognized as providers of essential labor while remaining excluded from the democratic processes that actually shape their lives. It also introduces the concept of democratic vulnerability as a framework for understanding this structural gap and its implication for participatory research. Before we begin, just a few, very few practical notes. We have about 1 hour for this webinar, and after Maria's presentation, we will have some time for questions, so no worries, and discussions. In the meantime, and during Maria's presentation, you can also use the chats within Teams platform to write some questions, some notes, some thoughts. Feel free to use it. Also, please note that the session is recorded, so you can always come back to the presentation on the YouTube channel of PAAR-Net, where you will find the recordings of this webinar, as well as the previous recordings of the 2 first webinars. And now, without further ado, I'm very happy to hand over to Maria. And I'll stop sharing my screen and give her the screen.
Great, thank you, Marianne. Thank you very much. I shall share my PowerPoint. Can everyone see that? Is that okay? Great.
Yes.
Fabulous, thank you. So thank you very much for the introduction, Marianne, and thank you very much to PAAR-Net and the organising team for this platform, really. I'm really pleased to be part of this wonderful series. I'm a gerontologist, so my work is mainly focused on older people and ageing, and in the past few years, I've been really focused on unpaid carers and unpaid carers of people living with dementia. So I'm really happy to be talking to you today about my recent work that's focused on beyond the breaking point, addressing the civic debt of unpaid carers in Wales. So I'll just give you an overview and guide you through what this presentation will be covering. So I want to take you through the research that's really been asking a straightforward but perhaps slightly uncomfortable question about what do we actually owe the people whose unpaid care in labour our long-term care systems depend upon, and that's mainly unpaid carers. So I'll cover some of the theoretical and the empirical evidence, and then draw from 2 original studies that I've been leading here in Wales and a comparative study in the Basque Country called DISC and Invaluable, and just give you some of the initial findings and some of the initial framework for understanding some of these things in the context of some of these questions that PAAR-Net has been focused on. And then I'll introduce you to and hope to have more of the discussion, and maybe outside of this platform, a discussion with people in the meeting today about a new programme of work that I'm developing called Cura, which I'm going to be developing into a European Research Council grant. So to begin, I'm going to sort of put the central claim of this paper here at the start, really, and just talk about the problem is that carers aren't not participating. It's just that what they are doing isn't necessarily recognised as participation in democratic life. So we know that caring is one of the most widespread things people do in later life. Nazman and Rodrigo Serrat and colleagues have shown this across using wave 7 of share data across 26 different European countries. But it's noticeably absent from the predominant forms of civic engagement definitions and measurements. And this shows up in policy, so the World Health Organization Active Aging Framework, which we know underpins all national aging strategies across many of the countries that we are part of. They name volunteering as a model of civic participation, and caring it isn't contained within that frame. It is referred to, but it's not contained within that frame. And what I'm suggesting here is that there's a kind of ageist logic, borrowing from Selma Sevenhuysen's logic, is that there's a kind of ageist logic operating underneath here. So carers get positioned as productive workers, relieving a kind of biomedicalized burden. And that burden is sort of biomedicalized and typifies older people as frail, dependent, and a problem to be managed. And within that logic, unpaid carers are then identified as service providers, and indeed they are the biggest providers of long-term care within global long-term care systems, but they're not valued in their own right. And I suggest this is part of sort of an implicit ageism and also the taint of dirty work, and particularly dirty work of older people that Clark and Raisingwood referred to in their really important and good paper, I think. So turning to sort of a worked policy example in Wales, and I won't spend too much time on this, but in Wales we have some genuinely progressive foundations, I think, for unpaid carers, which really are based upon the 2014 Social Services and Wellbeing Act in Wales, which gives carers for the first time a right to a carer's assessment for support that's equal to the person that has the need for care and support. So it's a genuine development. But what many, myself included, have argued, and the evidence demonstrates that this is actually quite a procedural right. So it gives you an access to assessment, but as I detail in the next few points, it's quite limited in its scope. And comparing this to the Welsh Fair Work legislation, which gives paid care workers a stand-in, conditions, union representation, that's a substantive stand-in, but unpaid carers have this sort of diminished just right to be assessed. So unpaid carers are excluded from this, and even with this procedural right, this is actually quite unevenly distributed, and there's only very few carers that have actually, and this comes from data from Welsh Government owned data, very few unpaid carers have actually had this carers needs assessment, and even fewer have had a support plan. And a recent inquiry into these very stark figures that was carried out by the Health and Social Care Committee of the Welsh Parliament concluded that little had changed since 2019, which is really when the Social Services and Wellbeing Act should have had gathered pace and implementation, but actually very little has changed for carers. And that report is actually entitled Beyond Breaking Point, which details some carers' first-hand accounts of how they're really suffering under what they term the burden, overwhelming burden of long-term care. So even when carers are trying to be recognised, we see that this is recognition without actual change. The eligibility for an assessment isn't actually turning into real rights for older people. And what my research is really understanding and trying to examine is, why is this care of older people so devalued, and why is there such that huge big gap between policy intention and implementation? So families are left to care by default. And what I'm looking at is how we can understand time spent caring as time that really does count. So turning to some of the theoretical reasons, or some of the theoretical explanations I'm borrowing from and developing my ideas on. So my work is really informed by theories and ideas by care theorists, particularly Hannah Kaya Hoppenauer, who refers to the depoliticization of care published in 2019. I think it gives us a really nice, useful theoretical anchor and starting point. So Hop and I tracked the legislative process of Finland's Care Act for older people and showed something really important, that what began as a fundamental question about values, about what we owe to older people and those who care for them, was gradually converted into a technical question, and care was being reframed and pushed out as an administrative problem rather than a political one. And then obviously when that happens, carers are not citizens making claims, they are service users to be managed. And then running alongside this depoliticisation of care is an approach to understanding care called feminist care ethics, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which understands the world as comprised of relationships and interdependency. Care is not a private burden, but a fundamental social and political practice. And one of the four thinkers in this is Joan Tronto. And carers are made vulnerable by their care work. And here I'm also borrowing from some of the work by Eva Kitay. So this work is really describing carers being made vulnerable by their dependency. And then finally, care ethics also forces us to see care as a gendered issue, not something that's neutral. Care work, we know, is overwhelmingly performed by women and girls. And feminist scholars like Anne Phillips have argued that household inequalities translate directly into political inequalities. So we see this empirically too. I know Rodrigo Serrat and Villar's life story work with Spanish political activists found that women's political participation doesn't simply continue across the life course, and we need to understand that life course gendered perspective, where women often have to pause some of that participation because of motherhood and caregiving, and that is in contrast to men who can have sort of more of a sustained, continuous political commitments throughout. So the exclusion from the political sphere isn't just structural, it's gendered at its root, and it's really how care ethics combined with this depoliticisation of care helps us to understand some of this work. So that's the theoretical foundation, and I'll now turn to some of the empirical work that I've been developing. So the findings that I'm going to share today come from two studies, and here's briefly how these studies are kind of mapped. The DISC and Invaluable study is looking at some of these fundamental questions. I'll explain in a bit more detail in different ways. They're generating an initial analytical framework that's asking what would social care look like if the value of unpaid care was measured, the civic value of unpaid care was measured as rigorously as economic savings. And like I say, this has been developed at scale, I hope, into a European Research Council comparative funding bid. So just to give you a bit more detail here on the method. So the central question, how is unpaid care valued and measured? And so on the left here, so I've got two funded programmes. On the left here, we're looking at carers themselves and the organisations around them. And the first study is funded through Wellcome and the British Academy. And it's a comparative study where we carried out focus groups with carers in both the Basque Country and Wales. And we asked unpaid dementia caregivers what they thought of standard economic evaluation measures used to assess quality of life and well-being. So these were the EQ5D, the IceCap, and the ASCOT. And we carried out these 6 focus groups, and we used a standard thematic analysis and obviously the sort of theoretical framework that I explained previously, informed by feminist care ethics. The second on the right here is the DISC funded through Healthcare Research Wales, looking at it from a different vantage point from how civil society and social enterprise organisations in Wales support unpaid carers. And what is the contribution of these to carer wellbeing, and really focused on that participation and that idea of co-production. So just turning now to the findings, across both studies, we've developed 3 sort of working themes that emerged. So we found that care is both simultaneously life-affirming and life-limited, and the existing measures, EQ5D, etc., this complexity is not acknowledged within these measures. Carer knowledge and civil society knowledge is generated, lots of reporting, lots of form filling, but then often systematically lost and ignored. And finally, the theme around participation without recognition. So carers are invited to participate, but not as democratic actors and not to political effect. So I'll just take each theme in turn here. So life affirming and life limiting. So this first theme emerged consistently across both the studies and across both countries. So this duality where caring is simultaneously life-affirming but also burdensome is absent from our current measures. And this participant here, who's caring for a mother in the Basque Country with dementia, described the moment her mother called her a daughter as winning the lottery. So these small sort of explained as small unexpected moments of connection were described as disproportionately sustaining. But none of the instruments had any mechanisms to capture these sort of life-sustaining, life-affirming aspects of care. But we also know that care and the empirical evidence shows that there's lots of structural penalties borne by unpaid carers, pension gaps, early exit from labour, health inequalities. But these things can sort of coexist. Life-affirming things, life-affirming and objectively measurable structural penalties do coexist. And I want to be clear as well that I'm not saying that all care is positive. There's lots of research where, you know, carers themselves can be harmed by the care, where carers can be abused. And it's this complexity that this theme is really trying to name. But what Invaluable found consistently across Wales and the Basque Country is that even though the carers described hardship, they would rather do it than not. So secondly, in running alongside this complexity is this guilt that again was described across both Wales and the Basque Countries. And it's this emotional experience that was also absent from the current measures. So the EQ5D reduces sort of the emotional aspects to anxiety and depression. And ASCOT doesn't really address the emotional experience directly, and IceCap couldn't distinguish between guilt-driven restriction from externally imposed restriction. So what we sort of suggested is that guilt is not primarily a psychological problem requiring this individual intervention. It's a structural signal. People are saying that caring is the most life-affirming thing that they can do, but they persistently feel guilty for not doing enough. And so what my question is really is because of this, is this unpaid care can be simultaneously depended upon because it's not recognised or valued. And now turning to the second theme, which is about knowledge and who generates it and what happens to it. So in both studies, we sort of captured sort of rich experiential relational knowledge as being continuously kind of produced. Carers know what works, what fails, and what they need. And civil society organisations also were saying that they have been telling commissioners, providers, what's working, but nothing was changing, and that describing it as a black hole really by one of these chief executive officers of one of the civil society national organisations in Wales. So nothing is changing, and this isn't a communication problem. Again, this is a structural problem where knowledge is generated at the front line of care, and it's also extracted through these reporting requirements, but then perhaps almost rendered inadmissible by the frameworks designed to govern and deliver care. And carers experience the same thing at that individual level here in this quote. Every time you ring, you speak to someone different and you've got to relay that, and that's exhausting within itself. So the knowledge that carers and expertise that carers have built up over years of caring sometimes is lost between each individual service contract. And this we point to, drawing upon Fricke, is an example of epistemic injustice. Knowledge that just doesn't fit isn't actually being counted. And now the final theme is participation without recognition. So one of the most consistent findings from the studies is that the relational work sustaining carers and communities that carers do requires time, but the system is structured against having and giving this time. And as one civil society organisation said, if you want to co-produce, you have to slow things down. And everything about the system is telling us to speed up. So co-production is sort of embedded within UK social care frameworks and elsewhere, particularly in Wales. It's named within commissioning frameworks, but the time and relational infrastructure that is required for genuine co-production just isn't funded. So the question is whether the result is participation that is more performative rather than real. And just moving here, for carers, the barriers go deeper. When caring is sort of so total, carers are consulted through surveys, through forums, but that consultation doesn't translate necessarily into political power. But if anything, it sort of translates into the policy discourse of carers being referred to as unsung heroes, as the backbone of long-term care systems. And we see this in numerous places throughout policy documents. And one carer described to me how she doesn't want to be referred to as an unsung hero. She wants to be referred to as someone who is recognised. And I'm just developing these ideas that commissioning practices that place co-production at its heart, but don't allow for time or resources. Maybe they are really reproducing the very exclusion that they claim to address. And carers are consulted, but it isn't translating into political power, and drawing upon sort of work by Nancy Fraser and others, that this is a sort of form where the carers are sort of, it's encoded as a natural thing for carers to do, and that we are the unsung heroes, and that's another form of that encoding, naturalising, sort of self-sacrificing discourse that we see. So my next steps really from the three themes is to sort of try and map this into an initial framework for understanding some of these issues. And we're mapping them across 3 dimensions. It's not prescriptive, it's very much under development. And perhaps it's sort of understood as more of a diagnostic lens, really. So epistemic dimension, where is carers' knowledge being generated, but also being erased? And how do we sort of treat carer and civil society evidence as intelligence rather than compliance data? And then institutionally, where can co-production actually have real impact rather than being hollow? It can actually produce power rather than performance. And really this final orange area is building upon some of the work by Oliver Escobar in Edinburgh and Bua, which critiques some of the democratic innovation sort of ways of having an over-reliance on sort of system affirming models of participation. So how can we actually get beyond some of these supposedly democratic innovations to actually empower unpaid carers to have some actual political change and voice in the systems? So summing up then, and some of the discussion, what does this evidence from the studies point to? So carers generate knowledge, they sustain relationships, they maintain the conditions under which vulnerable people remain members of their communities, And most say that they find meaning in what they do. And we found that in our small study across Wales and the Basque Country. Caring was described as intrinsic to identity and civic life. But what the evidence also shows is that contribution is systematically devalued and unmeasured. So we know that welfare systems count caring labour as a cost saving, not as a civic act. Quality of life measurements that we found and used to capture burden but not meaning. And that's the kind of devaluation that Bayer describes. Care time, I'm suggesting, is also misframed, to borrow from Fraser's term, counted within welfare and ageing frameworks, but as a saving to the state, but never as a civic contribution in its own right. And it's often reduced to a quantity or burden to be managed or redistributed, but not measured as a civic act. And we're developing this idea of democratic vulnerability based on some of this work and an additional piece that's currently under review. And we've defined it broadly as a structural condition in which a population is simultaneously essential to the function of the care infrastructure, but also systematically excluded from epistemic, institutional, and political structures through which protection and recognition is organised. And like I say, this is currently under review in the European Journal of Social Work. So the framework, I think, gives us the structural condition. It helps us understand how care is measured as a quantity, but not recognised as a political identity with democratic effect. So trying to generate it also encourages and supports us being able to generate alternative questions around how carers' capacity for political voice can actually help shape outcomes, not just measures of economic burden. And again, the work by Oliver Escobar and others on participation without affecting democratic innovation, I think, is really important to learn and draw upon. So just to finish off then, my work is sort of building to this European Research Council grant that will be coming in the next year or so, which aims to examine if and how different welfare states convert carers' participation into democratic standing, so voice, recognition, political identity and effect. And this is a comparative study, so I want to be working across different welfare regimes and identify case study sites where sort of this is happening or forming. And I'd really, really love it if people were able to share or have discussed some ideas around this or want to get in touch with me separately. And here is my email address, and thank you very much. That's my formal presentation done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria, for this very brilliant and thought-giving presentation. So now we have time about half an hour to discuss. Please feel free to raise your hand if you want to ask your question. I see Evelyn raised her hand. So we have question at the question box also. Caroline Crowley said, such thoughtful research, Maria, thank you. Do you have any ideas about how to measure civic value? That's a broad question.
Yeah, I think we need to, like I say, begin with the work with carers themselves, which is what the work of Invaluable was doing. So we were asking them questions on the existing measures and what was missing. So I think the question should be, how is your care? How do you see your care? And you know, we have done a lot of that sort of understanding in previous work was actually, you know, it isn't to be framed as this burden. typified by frailty and decline, which often working with older people, caring for older people it is actually something that can be positive and life affirming. How we get to that is a really tricky part of the puzzle. But I think we need to be building upon what carers themselves are saying and trying to move beyond that economic redistribution kind of argument, which all of our measures are based upon, and see carers as social civic contributors, as well as reducing long-term care budgets, but also as people in themselves who have civic contributions.
Thank you for this answer. Do you have any other question? I think you could use your microphone and cameras if you wanted to. Okay, I might jump in while other participants think of their thought and question. I really like this point that you made about the black hole, that knowledge is continuously produced by the caregivers, but nothing changes. And this made me think of some of my own research work and this observation that we often do. I'm working mostly on consultative bodies. And what we often see is there is kind of a gap or no communication between the space of participation and the space for decision. And that's very interesting to see what could make it happen, this communication or this dialogue between what's being produced within the space of participation and the one of decision.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's just while you were talking, I wondered a bit if you could give us, it might be a difficult task, but a short overview of the general architecture of spaces where caregivers are being able to be heard nowadays in Wales, as an example. And maybe to reflect on, okay, where those spaces do exist and how are they linked or not with the space for decision.
Yeah, like I say, we do have what considered fairly progressive instruments in Wales, and co-production is at the heart of the Social Services and Wellbeing Act, which is the main legislative framework for support and care. And within that sort of legislative framework, there's a statutory duty for local authorities, who are the sort of service providing bodies, statutory service providing bodies, to involve different population groups, and unpaid carers are named within that. And the sort of structure is regional partnership boards, RPBs. And some work has been carried out by Carers Wales, one of the national civil society organisations, about 2 years ago, on trying to understand and describe the numbers, the characteristics of carers who actually sit on those regional partnership boards, because they bring together health care, police, emergency services, everyone onto one table, and make budgetary decisions about service provision that obviously affect carers. And the reports, which I can share if people are interested, shows that there's a very small number of unpaid carers who are represented on these boards, despite that kind of intention and that instrument to encourage that. And they did a little bit of work to understand why, and it's sort of obvious things about time and the scarcity of time and the demands of care in itself. But I think there's also a lot around being sort of part of the fatigue, I suppose, we often hear of carers being asked, and particularly I think for carers, because they do have so much contact with service providers, with health and care professionals, but they're often sort of either not listened to or listened to, but not really acted upon. And I think that's something to sort of hold, particularly with this population group, because there is so much sort of advocacy work that they have to do on behalf of the person that they care for with these service providers. So sort of a fatigue, sort of some tired sort of accounts of being involved with these groups, nothing really happening, and also being over asked by service providers, and seeing again that their experience is actually diminished, and as not really value, of not value or importance.
Thank you so much. We have a comment here from Mariette Ackerman. Sorry for the pronunciation. She's telling that interesting point that carers' acquired knowledge is lost. I have been taking care of my parents after hours over the last 7 years, and I have been accepted into a study where my knowledge and lessons learned could be accommodated and documented. I never realized this topic benefit of my study. So thank you for highlighting that today.
Great. Yeah. Yeah, I think this is as it presented on this at the IAGG last week about this idea of, you know, carers having so much expertise and understanding, but having to, but that just often the research, empirical evidence states how carers feel unlistened to, unrecognised, and undervalued, and really trying to understand why that is sort of one of the key sort of points of this work, really. And I think sometimes despite the apparatus that we have, which is considered fairly strong in Wales, we have that huge gap between aspiration and actual implementation.
Thank you. So there is Caroline Crowley who would like to react. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Mary, and thanks very much, Maria, for your research. It's really interesting, really valuable. And I was struck by something you said earlier on in one of your slides about care, paraphrasing now, but I was just taking notes that it's not just structural, but it's gendered to its roots. And I find that really interesting because in some of my research, sitting in a group with men and women, and this would be in kind of other sectors, but very much coming from a community solidarity basis of working in community to try to improve community. So not care specifically, but when I talk about care relations, and I use Kathleen Lynch's effective relations of love, care, and solidarity. And literally the men are saying to me, these are deeply caring men who do incredible work in their communities. But the men in the room who were on a committee for a credit union, and there's women there as well, the men are like, they don't get the love and care part. They get the solidarity, care relations, effective relations. But when I'm talking about care, love and care as well, their eyes are kind of glazing over and they're saying, what do you mean by that? Whereas the women that are in the room, that are, you know, their peers in the community, it's so obvious to them what we're talking about. So I don't know if you can say any more about that, but, you know, thinking about all of the people that we are trying to share the research findings with in the institutions, you know, in the state, in the system itself, you know, it seems to be at the core of kind of them hearing us, of connecting with their hearts as well as their heads.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. We have to be really careful not to sort of encode care as women's work as naturalized. I think that's something that is obviously building from Virginia Hild and other sort of forerunners of feminist care ethics, where care work is sort of very much encoded as women's work. And I think in that same spirit and vein, really, we have to be really aware that increasingly men are doing a lot of the unpaid care work with their spouses. I did quite a lot of work with a men's carers group in Wales. There's a very few specific programs that are out there to support older male carers, and there's some proactive work being done by some of the carers centres here in Wales to actually address some of those needs as well. I think it's really important when we talk about love and the relational and the emotional aspects of care, that we have to also recognise also some of the damaging aspects of care as well. And I've written some work around some of that as well, because I think we would be doing a disjustice to some of that if we only focused on the life affirming aspect, which is kind of a difficult balance to strike, because I want to, in the work that I do, give definite voice and measure to what I hear from carers who push back on saying, don't diminish me to a hero. This work is actually part of what I see as my civility. You know, this is part of my identity. And that's where the sort of framing for it being civic contribution really stemmed from, when people were saying to me, don't call me a hero. I'm doing what, you know, in a civilized society I should be supported to do, but I want, you know, if with support, I think this is one of the most important jobs I can do. And we always have to caveat that with support, because I think otherwise, as we're seeing that retrenchment of the welfare state, you know, more and more carers are needed and doing more and more complex, really tough, hard work, working with and providing support to people living with sort of multiple morbidities. And it's becoming less and less recognised, I think, in many ways, with it becoming more and more prolific almost.
Thank you for this discussion. Does anyone have another comment or some thoughts or question? I know that summer is starting and the heat is very present, but don't be shy. Yeah, Caroline, please go ahead if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I'm just jumping in if nobody else is, because I am curious as well about, Maria, the regional partnership boards and the voice of carers in those spaces where they are kind of allowed in to have a seat at the table. And is there any, you know, what is happening there in terms of how they are being heard? Yeah, I'm just interested in how the system is hearing or not hearing them in those spaces that presumably have been created for that to happen.
Yeah, I think this is a really important aspect and part of the puzzle, really. And I'll sort of revisit the report that I referred to earlier by Carers Wales. There is lots, like I say, lots of fatigue, lots of tiredness. In theory, the regional partnership boards then feed into the representatives there, also feed into what's called a ministerial advisory forum for unpaid carers. So there we have carers represented and sitting alongside ministers, key civil servants, developing carer strategy at national level that then determines what happens at a local level. I mean, again, there's lots of things that can be said about these mechanisms. It's better to have them in place, not. But I point people towards some really interesting, important work, I think, being done by Oliver Escobar and others on how some of these mechanisms for democratic innovation, that they're termed, are actually more system affirming rather than system changing. So I think in Wales we have like a really interesting context in that we're fairly new, devolved context since only 30 years that we've had some of this primary legislation around health and care. And sort of at its heart, devolution provided equality, co-production, all of these sort of really important values and principles. So we can kind of track some of the policy rhetoric into some of these really important reports that are delivered by Carers Wales and see where the mismatch is happening. Yeah, I can give you some more detail on that if you'd like as well.
Thanks a lot. So we have another 5 minutes if anyone wants to share his or her thoughts or any question. So you can either use the comment parts or raise your hand. Okay, so Caroline shared her email with you, Maria. We'll be able to share it to you. We have one hand raised by Patty Doran. Please, Patty.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Maria. That was really interesting. You know, I'm very interested in participation and how we frame participation for older people, but caring is less of my expertise. So this question is a bit, yeah, it just reflects that I don't know a lot about caring perhaps, but I wonder about the term unpaid carer. I've noticed like some people refer to people more as informal carers, and I kind of think the term unpaid kind of it monetizes it in a way that I'm not very comfortable with. I just kind of think it kind of takes away from the fact, kind of what we were just talking about before about the caring and the, you know, the desire to care. You know, it's not necessarily something that people want to be directly paid for, just acknowledged or supported in other ways perhaps, and that might be financially. But anyway, I just wonder about the term unpaid care, and I know it's not used, you know, universally outside of the UK, and I wonder if you could just comment on that.
Yeah, it's really, really good point and really important point. So yeah, in the UK, it's unpaid care. In all the policy descriptions, we refer to unpaid carers. Elsewhere, we have informal family care in US and Canada. Yeah, I mean, it says a lot, doesn't it, I think, and that's the important work that sociologists and people like us can really do and examine, I think, is how important it is and how we frame it. I think my work is very much against, obviously, trying to ask a different question about unpaid care that isn't, you know, reductive and monetizing it. And there's been plenty of work around commodification of care, marketization of care. Again, a lot of feminist theory, Federici and others arguing that we need to be redistributing care, compensating for care. And in Wales, the carers strategy has been under consultation, and there's been a response that is basically recommending that we have more money to support unpaid carers. So the answers are often about giving more ad hoc payments to carers, and there's also at Westminster level some work being done to look at the carers allowance, which is one of the lowest universal benefits in the UK welfare system. So I think absolutely we need to be dissecting and critiquing and problematizing how we use the term, and why the term, I think, kind of confines us to reducing care to just that economic metric. Whether I have another suggestion is, I mean, some people say that informal care also can diminish care by making it informal. I'm not informal, I'm actually formally doing this. So it kind of, it could also contribute to the argument of it being invisible or perhaps non-essential. And caregiver, there's been lots of work around what carers themselves would like to be recognised as, and caregiver, supporter. I did some research that interviewed carers around that, and lots of people like supporter. But I think, yeah, we have to keep the problematization of the terms that we use going. And I think it's a really important point, particularly not very helpful, I think, for the arguments that I and others are making, that care is often just reduced to helping to relieve the burden. And actually we can only measure unpaid care by its economic contribution in relieving that burden.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So here, Caroline let us know that in Ireland, the term that is being used is family carer.
Yeah.
And Mariette Ackerman from South Africa, I guess, I have been guided, she says, to use the term familial caregiving as what I provide in contrast to formal care, which would be a paid service in my country.
Yeah.
So we have a more diverse understanding of the terms that are being used.
Yeah. I think there's problems and issues, but with family care, it can then obviously confine it just to kinship relations. And yeah, there's lots of care is carried out by friends, neighbours, acquaintances that could also be come into unpaid care. So it's a really difficult one in terms and definitions.
Thank you. So thank you very much. I would suggest to close this session here now, if there is no further question, as we are approaching the ending time. Maria, again, many thanks for sharing your fascinating presentation, and I really loved how this knowledge is building on different projects, and you continue building this knowledge on this specific topic that's very thoughtful, and it provokes a lot of discussion among us, a lot of thoughts about our own work. I would also like to thank everyone who joined us today. Thank you for coming to joining us. And with today's session, we come to the end of this first edition of our Working Group 2 webinar series on meaningful participation and voice. So over the summer, we will reflect on possible next steps of this webinar series and on future Working Group 2 activities. And whatever comes next, be sure that we will keep you informed after the summer break. Thank you again for your interest and engagement through this whole series of webinar. And we wish you all a wonderful summer, hopefully a wonderful summer break as well. And we hope to see you again very soon.
Thank you very much. Take
care. Have a good afternoon. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Marianne.
You're welcome. I think I could stop the event and we might be in the room again.
No worries.
Let's try.